On glossy pages she smiled eternal youth. In private journals she wrote, "Fantasies don't last forever." At 28, Elisa Bridges discovered how terrifyingly right she was. February 7, 2002. A quiet house in the Hollywood Hills. Morning light filters through curtains that have remained drawn for days. Inside, in a bedroom that smells faintly of perfume and something darker, a young woman lies motionless on the bed. Elisa Bridges, 28 years old, Playmate of the Month for December 1994, one of the most radiant faces to grace the pages of Playboy in the 1990s, is gone. The coroner's report will later confirm what friends already suspected: an overdose, a lethal cocktail of sedatives and alcohol. No signs of foul play, no suicide note, just silence. The news breaks like a shockwave through the entertainment world. Headlines scream variations of the same tragic refrain: Playboy Playmate found dead. The photographs they run alongside these stories show a woman who seemed to embody vitality itself: blonde hair cascading over bare shoulders, a smile that could light up a room, eyes that promised everything a fantasy should promise. But those who knew her, really knew her, saw something else in those eyes. A loneliness. A yearning to be seen not just as a body in a magazine, but as a human being with a heart that beat and bled and broke. "They loved my body," she once confided to a friend, "but I wanted them to know my heart. The official cause of death is ruled accidental." But in the world Elisa inhabited, a world of mansion parties, champagne fountains, and men who wielded cameras like weapons, accidents are rarely simple. Friends whisper about the pressures she faced, the demons she battled, the isolation she felt even when surrounded by crowds. There are questions, too. Why was she at that particular house? Who were the last people to see her alive? And why, in the final months of her life, did those closest to her notice a change in her demeanor? A sadness that no amount of makeup could conceal. The world mourns the loss of a playmate, another beautiful woman claimed too young by the dark undertow of fame. But who was Elisa Bridges beyond the glossy pages and the fantasies she helped create? What dreams did she carry before Playboy discovered her? And what nightmares haunted her in the years that followed? Was this really just an accidental overdose? Or was something far more insidious at play in the glittering, predatory world she called home? To understand how it all ended, we must first understand how it all began. Dallas, Texas. May 24, 1973. Elisa Rebecca Bridges enters the world in a place far removed from the velvet ropes and champagne-soaked parties that will one day define her public image. Her childhood is unremarkable in the way most American childhoods are: suburban streets, school days, family dinners. But even then, there are hints of something different about her. Friends from those early years remember a girl who loved to dance, who moved with an unconscious grace that drew eyes even in the chaos of a school gymnasium. She writes in journals, filling page after page with thoughts she shares with no one. Even as a child, there is a part of Elisa that remains hidden, a private self she guards carefully. Her family is neither wealthy nor destitute. They are ordinary people living ordinary lives, which makes Elisa's later transformation all the more remarkable and all the more tragic. She grows up in an era when women like Marilyn Monroe and Jane Mansfield still loom large in the cultural imagination. Proof that beauty can be a ticket to another life entirely. Does young Elisa dream of such transformations as she dances alone in her bedroom, as she studies her reflection in the mirror? Does she sense even then that her face and body might be her passport to a world beyond Dallas? There are no early scandals, no dramatic childhood traumas that explain what comes later. If anything, the absence of such narratives makes her story more unsettling. Elisa is not running from abuse or poverty. She is simply a young woman who discovers early on that the world will give her things, attention, opportunity, access, if she is willing to offer herself up to its gaze. And she is willing, desperately willing. Because more than anything, Elisa wants to be seen. In her teenage journals, she writes about feeling invisible despite her obvious beauty. She writes about wanting to matter, to be remembered, to leave some mark on the world that proves she existed. It is a tragically common desire made dangerous by the limited options available to young women in the early 1990s, whose primary asset is their physical appearance. By her late teens, Elisa is modeling locally. Nothing glamorous, just catalog work and small advertisements. She has the kind of beauty that photographs well, symmetrical features, luminous skin, a quality of openness that makes viewers feel like they know her, like she might be the girl next door if the girl next door happened to look like a movie star. But catalog modeling in Dallas is a far cry from the bright lights she craves. She wants more. She wants to be seen by millions. She wants her face to be the one men dream about, the one that stops them in their tracks. Could her childhood experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs or tragedies? Was there something in the ordinariness of her upbringing that made the extraordinary world of Playboy irresistible? Or was it precisely because she came from nowhere special that she felt the need to become someone spectacular, even if it meant sacrificing everything she actually was? In 1994, everything changes. Hugh Hefner, the architect of modern male fantasy, the man who built an empire on the bodies of beautiful women, sees something in Elisa Bridges. She is chosen to be Playmate of the Month for December, the final centerfold of the year, a position that carries special weight in the Playboy universe. It is a validation and a sentence all at once. The shoot is everything Elisa has dreamed of and everything she should fear. The Playboy photographers are masters of their craft, experts at transforming women into fantasies, at erasing the human and emphasizing the ideal. Under their lenses, Elisa becomes something else. No longer a girl from Dallas with thoughts and fears and a journal full of private longings, but a vision, an object of desire for millions of men she will never meet. Her blonde hair is teased into golden waves that catch the light like spun silk. Her skin is airbrushed to impossible smoothness. Her smile is perfect, the smile of a woman who has no worries, no doubts, no inner life beyond the pleasure of being looked at. The photographer directs her. Think fantasy, think every man's dream. And Elisa does. She empties herself out and fills the space with what they want her to be. It is easier than she expected, this transformation. Almost too easy. When the December 1994 issue hits newsstands, Elisa's life transforms overnight. She is no longer anonymous. Men recognize her in restaurants, on the street, their eyes lighting up with recognition and desire. Some approach her with compliments, others simply stare. She is invited to the legendary Playboy Mansion, that sprawling monument to hedonism in the Hollywood Hills, where the boundaries between fantasy and reality blur into irrelevance. The first time she walks through those gates, Elisa feels like she has arrived at the center of the universe. The parties are everything the rumors promised. Champagne flowing like water, beautiful women draped over powerful men, celebrities and athletes and musicians mingling in grottos and poolside cabanas. The atmosphere is one of permissiveness, of anything-goes excess, and Elisa is intoxicated by it all. Hugh Hefner himself takes notice of her. He compliments her centerfold, tells her she has the look. It is the validation she has been seeking her entire life, and she drinks it in like someone dying of thirst. She becomes a fixture at the mansion, invited back again and again. She appears on Playboy TV, her face and body broadcast into homes across America. She is living the dream she barely dared to articulate back in Dallas. But even in these early intoxicating days, there are moments of doubt. After a particularly wild party, she writes in her journal, Being a playmate is like being a fantasy, but fantasies don't last forever. It is a prescient observation, a recognition that what she has achieved is inherently temporary, that the same beauty that has elevated her will one day betray her. The modeling work is more competitive than she anticipated. For every playmate who parlays her centerfold into a lasting career, becoming an actress, a television personality, a brand, there are dozens who fade into obscurity within months. Elisa works hard to stay relevant, taking every gig Playboy offers, more TV appearances, special editions, promotional events at clubs and casinos. She smiles until her face hurts. She poses until her body aches. She learns to be on 24 hours a day because you never know who might be watching, who might offer the next opportunity. Friends from this period remember Elisa as warm and friendly, always ready with a smile and a kind word. But they also remember moments when the mask would slip, when the exhaustion would show. "They loved my body," she tells one friend late one night, her words slightly slurred from champagne. "But I wanted them to know my heart." Was the success she achieved truly worth all the pain she endured? Could anyone have predicted that the girl who smiled so radiantly on the December 1994 centerfold would be dead before her 30th birthday? Or was her fate sealed the moment she agreed to step in front of those cameras, the moment she chose to become a fantasy instead of remaining human? By the mid to late 1990s, Elisa Bridges is at the height of her Playboy fame. Her face appears in the prestigious special editions, Playmate Review 1997, various anniversary issues, the kind of compilations that celebrate the franchise's most memorable beauties. She is a fixture at the mansion, a familiar presence at Hugh Hefner's side during public events, one of his stable of gorgeous young women who make him look virile and powerful well into his 70s. To the outside world, she is living every man's fantasy and presumably living her own dream. The glamour is undeniable. There are trips to exotic locations for photo shoots, Caribbean beaches, European castles, desert landscapes where the sun turns her skin golden. Her wardrobe is filled with designer clothes provided by Playboy for public appearances. She has VIP access to the hottest clubs and parties in Los Angeles, where celebrities and athletes compete for her attention. The champagne never stops flowing. The parties never end. In photographs from this era, the professional ones that appear in Playboy, Elisa is radiant, seemingly carefree, the embodiment of sexual availability and joy. She wears barely there bikinis and poses with props that emphasize her curves. She straddles motorcycles and lounges in hot tubs and gazes at the camera with eyes that promise pleasure without complications. She is the ultimate male fantasy. Beautiful, available, uncomplicated by inner life or personal needs. But beneath the surface, cracks are forming. Those who spend real time with Elisa during these years notice things. She drinks more than she used to, not just at parties, but alone in her apartment. Her laughter sometimes has a brittle quality, as if she is performing happiness rather than feeling it. There are nights when she disappears from parties early, retreating to solitude when she should be reveling in attention. The journals continue, filled with observations she shares with almost no one. The fundamental problem is one that Elisa herself articulates but cannot solve. The world wants her fantasy, not her reality. The men who pursue her are attracted to the woman in the magazine, the fantasy creature with perfect skin and an eternally inviting smile. They have no interest in the actual Elisa, the woman who gets sad, who worries about her future, who wants to talk about books and art and whether her life has meaning. Her romantic relationships during this period are fleeting and unsatisfying. There are rumors of affairs with men in the entertainment industry, connections forged in the hothouse atmosphere of mansion parties. But nothing lasts. How could it? The men who are attracted to playmates rarely see them as fully human. They want the fantasy, and when the real woman inevitably emerges with needs and emotions and complexity, they lose interest. The loneliness is crushing. Elisa is surrounded by people constantly, at parties, at photo shoots, at promotional events, but she feels profoundly alone. She is performing a role every waking moment, and the performance is exhausting. In a journal entry from 1997, she writes, "I wonder if anyone would still want me if I stopped smiling, if I stopped being beautiful, if I just stopped." Behind all that glamour, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? Did Elisa lie awake at night in her bedroom surrounded by the trappings of success and feel more isolated than she ever felt back in Dallas? The evidence overwhelmingly suggests she did. Friends report that she often spoke of wanting to be remembered as more than just a body in a magazine, as someone who cared about things beyond her appearance. But in the world she inhabited, such desires were not just irrelevant, they were actively discouraged. A playmate who thinks too much, who wants too much, who needs too much is a liability. The photographs from this era tell their own story. In the professional shots, the ones that appear in Playboy, Elisa is radiant, seemingly carefree. But in the candid photographs, the ones taken at parties by friends, there is often something different in her eyes. A distance, a sadness. As if she is present in body but absent in spirit, going through the motions of a life that no longer feels like her own. And always, underneath everything, there is the knowledge that time is running out. In the Playboy universe, youth is everything. A playmate's shelf life is shockingly short. New girls arrive every month, each one younger and hungrier than the last, and Elisa can see her own obsolescence approaching like a train she cannot stop. The late 1990s marked the beginning of Elisa's slow unraveling, though few people recognize it at the time. The warning signs are subtle, easy to dismiss in a world where excess is normalized and self-destruction is often mistaken for glamour. The first public indication that something is wrong comes not in the form of a scandal, but in a kind of fading. Elisa's appearances in Playboy become less frequent. The special editions still feature her occasionally, trading on the nostalgia of her December 1994 centerfold. But there are no new major spreads, no covers, no centerfolds. In the Playboy ecosystem, this is a kind of death, a slow erasure as newer playmates claim the spotlight she once occupied. For a woman whose entire identity has been wrapped up in being desired, being seen, being the fantasy. This fading is psychologically catastrophic. Elisa watches as the camera operators who once fell over themselves to shoot her now barely acknowledge her presence. She sees younger girls who were in middle school when her centerfold came out, take her place at mansion parties, giggling and drinking champagne and basking in the attention that used to be hers. The parties that once seemed exciting now feel hollow and menacing. She still attends them. What else is there to do? But she no longer has the energy to pretend they matter. She drinks more heavily, seeking numbness rather than pleasure. She begins taking sedatives to manage the anxiety that claws at her constantly. Pills to wake up, pills to sleep, pills to get through the day, pills to quiet the voice in her head that whispers she is worthless, invisible, already dead. Friends report that Elisa becomes increasingly withdrawn and anxious during this period. The bright, friendly woman who once lit up every room grows quieter, more guarded. She cancels plans. She stops returning calls. When she does show up to events, she looks tired, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. There are whispers of financial troubles as well. Playmate money, while substantial during peak years, is not enough to sustain a lifetime, especially when one's lifestyle has expanded to match the income. Modeling gigs dry up as newer faces dominate the market. Elisa is not frivolous with money, but she is also not equipped to navigate the financial realities of a career that has no obvious second act. What does a former playmate do when the calls stop coming? When the men who once couldn't take their eyes off her now look right through her? The real tragedy is not that Elisa is being forgotten, though she is, but that she seems to have anticipated this outcome from the beginning. Those journal entries, those late-night confessions to friends, they all point to a woman who understood the Faustian bargain she had made. She traded her privacy, her autonomy, her very selfhood for a few years of fame and attention. And now the bill is coming due. In her journal she writes, "I don't know if playmates survive past the dream." It reads like a question, but it is really a recognition. She is watching herself fade in real time, and there is nothing she can do to stop it. The industry that built her up has moved on, and she is left stranded in the wreckage of her own image. Did this tragic fading mark her downfall? Or was it simply the inevitable endpoint of a journey that was always going to end this way? Could any playmate truly survive the transition from fantasy object to regular human being? Or is the role itself a kind of trap, beautiful and deadly, that consumes the women who dare to enter it? Those closest to Elisa during these final years describe a woman in the grip of profound internal conflict. On one hand, she is trying to move on, to build a life beyond Playboy. There is talk of acting lessons, of trying to break into legitimate film or television work. She attends auditions hoping that someone will see her as more than just a former playmate. But the industry has no interest in giving her that chance. Casting directors see Playboy playmate on her resume and make assumptions. They want her for bit parts, background eye candy, roles that trade on her centerfold fame rather than any actual talent. On the other hand, Elisa is clinging to the identity that made her famous, unable or unwilling to let it go. She still attends mansion events when invited, still maintains connections with Playboy insiders, still presents herself as a playmate even as that title becomes increasingly historical. It is as if she cannot decide whether to embrace the person she was or to become someone new, and the indecision paralyzes her. The substance abuse worsens dramatically. The pills and alcohol are no longer recreational. They are survival mechanisms, ways to numb the pain of irrelevance and aging in a youth-obsessed industry. She mixes sedatives with wine, a dangerous combination that leaves her foggy and disconnected. Friends try to intervene, suggesting rehab, offering support, but Elisa is resistant. Perhaps she does not believe she deserves saving. Perhaps she has internalized the Playboy message too completely, that her value lies in her body, and if that body is no longer young and perfect, then what value does she have? The psychological toll of living as a fantasy for so many years cannot be overstated. Elisa has been trained to see herself through the male gaze, to measure her worth by her ability to provoke desire. But desire is fickle, and time is undefeated. As she approaches 30, an age that would be considered young in any other context but is practically elderly in the world of playmates, she can feel herself becoming invisible. "They loved my body," she tells a friend during one of their last conversations. "But I wanted them to know my heart." It is a refrain she has repeated for years, a wish that will never be granted. The journals from this period make for devastating reading. She writes about feeling like a ghost haunting her own life. She writes about the terror of waking up each morning and having to face another day of irrelevance. She writes about wondering if anyone would even notice if she simply disappeared. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? Can a woman who has been reduced to her physical attributes reclaim her full humanity? Or has too much been sacrificed, too much of the essential self eroded by years of performance and objectification? The final year of Elisa Bridges' life is marked by a kind of quiet desperation that is invisible to all but those who know where to look. By 2001, she is no longer a fixture at Playboy events. The invitations have largely stopped coming. The phone rings less frequently. The world that once seemed so eager to consume her has moved on to younger bodies, fresher fantasies. She retreats from the public eye, not by choice but by circumstance. There is no dramatic announcement, no farewell interview. She simply fades the way most playmates eventually do, into the background static of entertainment history. Those who remember her at all remember the photograph. The blonde hair, the smile, the perfect embodiment of 1990s Playboy fantasy. But the woman behind the photograph is unknown, unknowable, already becoming a ghost. In these final months, Elisa's substance use is no longer about recreation or even habit. It is about survival. She is self-medicating against pain that has no clear source and no obvious cure. The pain of irrelevance. The pain of aging in a culture that worships youth. The pain of having sold her most intimate self and received nothing lasting in return. She moves between friends' houses, never quite settling, never quite belonging. The apartment she once kept in Los Angeles is gone, a casualty of financial instability and eviction notices she couldn't afford to ignore. Her possessions have been reduced to what fits in a few suitcases. Clothes from her modeling days that no longer fit quite right. Photographs from parties she can barely remember. Journals filled with thoughts too painful to revisit. One friend later recalls a conversation from this period that haunts her still. I asked Elisa what she wanted to do with the rest of her life. She just looked at me like the question didn't make sense. Like the idea of a future was something she couldn't even imagine anymore. By early 2002, Elisa is staying at a friend's house in the Hollywood Hills. The friend will later tell police that Elisa seemed troubled but not suicidal, drinking heavily but no more than usual. It is a portrait of a woman in crisis that no one recognizes as a crisis until it is too late. Everyone assumes she is just going through a rough patch, that she will pull herself together eventually. No one intervenes decisively. No one insists she get help. Were these final decisions acts of surrender or courageous acts of self-preservation? Was Elisa's withdrawal from public life a recognition that the game was no longer worth playing? Or was it a kind of slow suicide, a gradual giving up that wouldn't be complete until that February morning? On the night of February 6, 2002, Elisa writes in her journal. The entry is brief, almost cryptic, written in handwriting that looks shakier than usual. I don't know if playmates survive past the dream. It is a question she has been asking for years, a question she is about to answer definitively. She takes pills, sedatives she has been prescribed for anxiety, mixed with others she has obtained less officially. She drinks wine, more than is safe to combine with the medication. Whether this is intentional or accidental will never be known for certain. Perhaps Elisa herself does not know in those final moments. Perhaps the line between giving up and miscalculation has become too blurred to matter. Sometime in the early hours of February 7, 2002, Elisa Bridges stops breathing. There is no one there to witness it, no one to call for help. She dies alone in a borrowed bedroom in the Hollywood Hills, 28 years old, her whole life simultaneously ahead of her and already over. February 7, 2002. Morning light reveals what the night has taken. Elisa Bridges is found unresponsive in the bedroom, lying peacefully as if asleep. Paramedics arrive, but there is nothing to be done. She has been dead for hours, possibly since the previous night. The scene is not violent, not even particularly dramatic. Just a young woman who took too many pills, drank too much alcohol, and never woke up. The autopsy report is clinical in its assessment. Acute drug intoxication, specifically a combination of sedatives and alcohol. The death is ruled accidental. There is no evidence of foul play, no indication that anyone else was directly involved. It is, the authorities conclude, a tragic but not uncommon outcome for someone struggling with substance abuse. But is it really that simple? In the days and weeks following Elisa's death, questions emerge from those who knew her. Friends wonder why she was at that particular house, what she was doing there, who she was with in her final hours. Some recall her talking about feeling pressured, about people in the industry who had power over her, about situations that made her uncomfortable. These are vague allegations, the kind that are easy to dismiss as paranoia or the product of an unstable mind. The truth is probably less dramatic but more damning than any conspiracy theory. Elisa died because she was alone, drowning in substances that promised relief from pain but delivered only oblivion. She died because the industry that created her had no safety net for women who fell. She died because in Playboy's universe, once a Playmate's usefulness expired, she became invisible, dispensable, already forgotten. The Playboy machine responds with appropriate mourning. Hugh Hefner releases a statement expressing sadness at the loss of a beautiful woman and talented model who graced our pages. Fellow Playmates post tributes on early social media and fan sites, remembering Elisa as sweet and kind and gone too soon. The tone is elegiac but also strangely distant, as if they are mourning the idea of her rather than the person. But there is also a silence, a reluctance to examine too closely the environment that produced Elisa, and arguably destroyed her. No one at Playboy asks uncomfortable questions about whether the culture of the mansion contributed to her death. No one investigates the pressures placed on Playmates, the lack of support systems, the way women are used up and discarded. It is easier to frame her death as a personal failing. She couldn't handle the lifestyle, she made bad choices, than to acknowledge systemic problems. Because here is the uncomfortable truth that no one wants to say out loud. Elisa Bridges is not an anomaly. She is part of a pattern, a recurring tragedy in the history of Playboy. Dorothy Stratton, murdered at 20 by an abusive husband. Her story turned into a cautionary tale about the price of fame. Anna Nicole Smith, dead at 39 from an overdose eerily similar to Elisa's. Her later years a public spectacle of addiction and mental illness. Cassandra Lynn, struggling with substance abuse and legal troubles for years after her Playmate days ended. The list of Playmates who met tragic ends is long enough to suggest that something about the Playmate experience itself is toxic, that the fantasy exacts a price far higher than anyone admits. These are not isolated incidents, but evidence of a pattern, proof that the Playboy dream has a dark underbelly that destroys the women who try to live it. The funeral is small, attended mostly by family and a handful of friends from before the Playboy years. People who remember Elisa as she was before she became a fantasy. The entertainment industry, which was so eager to consume Elisa while she was alive and beautiful, is largely absent in death. A few former Playmates attend, their presence more about honoring the shared experience than any deep personal connection. They cry for Elisa, but they also cry for themselves, for the recognition that her fate could easily have been theirs. The contrast with her years of fame is stark and telling. When Elisa was a Playmate, she couldn't go anywhere without being recognized, couldn't attend an event without cameras flashing. But at her funeral there are no paparazzi, no media coverage beyond brief obituaries that reduce her entire life to Playboy Playmate found dead. The world that elevated her to fantasy status has already moved on, already forgotten her, already focused on the next beautiful young woman willing to take her place. In the media coverage that follows, Elisa is reduced once again to her Playmate status. The headlines focus on her beauty, her centerfold, the tragedy of a Playboy model dying young. But there is little interest in who she was beyond that role, what she dreamed about, what she suffered, what she might have become if given the chance. The stories run the same photographs, the ones from her December 1994 centerfold, the ones where she is eternally young and smiling and perfect. They do not run photographs from her final years when the wear showed, when the fantasy was crumbling? Was her death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? Not in the sense of conspiracy theories or murder plots. The evidence supports the official finding of accidental overdose, but in the more insidious sense of an industry that chews up vulnerable young women and spits them out when their usefulness expires. Hugh Hefner built an empire by convincing the world that objectifying women was liberation, that posing nude was empowerment, that playmates were living every woman's dream. But how many women like Elisa Bridges paid the real price for that empire? How many beautiful young women were transformed into fantasies and then destroyed when they proved to still be human? The theories that circulate in the aftermath are less about what physically happened on the night of February 7th and more about why. Why did Elisa turn to drugs and alcohol in the first place? Why couldn't she escape the orbit of Playboy even when it was clearly destroying her? Why didn't anyone intervene more aggressively? Why is her story so common among playmates? These are questions that make people uncomfortable because they implicate not just individuals but entire systems. The entertainment industry that trades in female bodies, the culture of objectification that reduces women to their physical attributes, the commodification of sexuality that treats human beings as products with expiration dates. Elisa's legacy is complicated and contested. She is remembered when she is remembered at all as a cautionary tale, the playmate who couldn't survive past the dream. Her images continue to circulate online in vintage Playboy collections on websites dedicated to the models of the 1990s. Men who were teenagers when her centerfold was published are now middle-aged, and they remember her with a mix of nostalgia and sadness. She represents something they thought they wanted, the perfect fantasy woman without any of the messy reality that fantasy concealed. For feminist critics and scholars who study the objectification of women in media, Elisa's story is evidence of everything wrong with Playboy and similar enterprises. She was exploited, commodified, reduced to her body parts, and then discarded when that body was no longer profitable. Her death is not an accident but an inevitable outcome of a system designed to use women up and throw them away. The fact that Playboy frames itself as pro-woman, as celebrating female sexuality and beauty, makes the exploitation even more insidious. For those who knew Elisa personally, the legacy is more intimate and more painful. They remember a woman who was kind, who loved to dance, who wrote in journals because she had thoughts and feelings that no one cared to hear. They remember someone who was lonely even when surrounded by people, who wrote, "They loved my body, but I wanted them to know my heart, and never got that wish fulfilled." They remember a human being, not a fantasy, and they grieve for the life she might have lived if the world had allowed her to be human. In the years since her death, there have been attempts to memorialize Elisa more fully, to rescue her story from the reductive, tragic Playmate narrative. A few documentaries about the dark side of Playboy mention her in passing, usually as one name in a list of playmates who died young. Online forums dedicated to Playboy history keep her memory alive, though often in ways that focus more on her physical beauty than her inner life or the circumstances of her death. There is no official monument, no scholarship in her name, no lasting tribute beyond the photographs that made her famous and, in many ways, killed her. The question that haunts Elisa's story is not whether her death was accidental. The medical evidence overwhelmingly supports that conclusion, but whether it was inevitable. Given the trajectory of her life, the pressures she faced, the identity she constructed around being a playmate, could any other ending have been possible? Or was she doomed from the moment she stepped in front of those cameras in 1994, from the moment she agreed to transform herself from a person into a fantasy? Some argue that Elisa had agency, that she made choices and must bear responsibility for them. She chose to pose for Playboy. She chose to embrace the lifestyle. She chose to use drugs and alcohol. But this argument ignores the profound power dynamics at play. The way young women are groomed by an industry that profits from their vulnerability. The severely limited options available to women whose primary asset is their physical appearance in a culture that simultaneously worships and punishes female beauty. Others see Elisa as purely a victim, a young woman from Dallas who was chewed up by the Hollywood machine and spit out when she was no longer useful. This view has merit but also risks stripping Elisa of her humanity in a different way, reducing her to a passive object of pity rather than a complex person who navigated impossible circumstances as best she could. The truth, as always, exists somewhere in the tension between these extremes. Elisa Bridges was both agent and victim, making choices within constraints she did not create and could not escape. She wanted the glamour, the attention, the validation that came with being a playmate. But she also wanted to be seen, really seen, as a person with thoughts and feelings and worth beyond her body. The tragedy is that the world that gave her the former made the latter impossible. What if there had been robust support systems in place for playmates transitioning out of the spotlight? What if there had been accessible mental health resources, financial planning assistance, career counseling that didn't assume a playmate's only value was her body? What if Hugh Hefner and Playboy Enterprises had taken genuine responsibility for the well-being of the women they profited from instead of treating them as disposable commodities? These are not idle questions. They point to systemic failures that continue to this day, in an industry that still treats women's bodies as products and their lives as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of profit. Elisa's story raises profound questions about fame, fantasy, and the price women pay for male pleasure. It asks us to consider what we consume when we consume images of beautiful women, what responsibilities we bear as participants in a culture of objectification. It challenges the narrative that Playboy was ever about liberation or empowerment, revealing instead the brutal economics of an empire built on young women's bodies and sustained by their exploitation. In the end, Elisa Bridges wanted to be remembered not just as a body in a magazine, but as someone who cared. She wanted her heart to be known, not just her physical form. She wanted to matter in ways that transcended her appearance. The cruel irony is that in death, as in life, she is denied that wish. She is remembered as a playmate, a fantasy, a beautiful woman who died too young. The person she actually was remains elusive, hidden behind the glossy images and the tragic headlines. Elisa Bridges didn't die of an overdose alone. She died of a culture that made her a fantasy and forgot she was human. She died because the Playboy dream promised liberation but delivered objectification. She died because in a world that values women primarily for their bodies, aging is a kind of death sentence. She died because no one, not Hefner, not Playboy, not the industry, not the culture, took responsibility for what happens to the women after the fantasy fades. 20 years after her death, the pattern continues. Young women are still being recruited to pose for Playboy and similar enterprises, still being told that their bodies are their greatest asset, still being transformed into fantasies for male consumption. And when those fantasies fade, when those women prove to still be human with needs and emotions and vulnerabilities, they are still being discarded and forgotten. What can we learn from Elisa's story? That beauty is not power, despite what the culture tells us. That fame is not fulfillment, no matter how intoxicating it feels in the moment. That systems that profit from objectification will never prioritize the well-being of those they objectify. That fantasies, no matter how alluring, cannot sustain a real human life. Elisa Bridges was 28 years old when she died. Her whole life ahead of her, yet somehow already over. She was a daughter, a friend, a woman with dreams and fears and a desperate need to be seen. She was also a playmate, a fantasy, an object of desire for millions who never knew her name. She was both, and she was neither, and in the end, She was just another casualty of an industry that devours young women and asks no questions about the bodies it leaves behind. If fantasies are built on women's bodies, what happens when the fantasy fades? But the woman is still alive, still human, still longing to be seen. How many more Elisa Bridges must there be before we admit that the Playboy dream was never liberation at all, but a machine that eats women alive?